Now, the American Gunsmithing Institute presents another instructional video on firearms design, operation, maintenance, and repair.
Welcome to the Armorer's course on the FAL rifle. We're going to be covering the FN FAL of metric configuration. We're going to be covering the C1s from Canada. We'll be covering the L1A1s out of Australia. We'll be showing you the differences. And we're going to start off with a look of what used to be the standard configuration rifle. It was in full military configuration with a flash hider, muzzle brake, bayonet lug, pistol grip, and a standard stock. The rifle you may see in the stores and in the magazines now are going to not have a muzzle brake, will not have a pistol grip except in this thumb hole stock configuration. A little bit of history on the FAL. At the end of World War II, most countries outside the United States were armed with bolt-action rifles, so there was a tremendous need to rearm and re-equip most armies of the world. There was a lot of research that came out of both World War II Germany and Britain and the United States. When FN factory was overrun by the Germans, most of the engineering staff went to Britain and worked on a rifle which evolved into the FN 49, which was sold in South America and various other parts of the world. The FN FAL carried over many of those things. You'll notice that the gas plug, the gas adjustment, is essentially directly off the FN 49. But one of the things that was learned during World War II by the Germans in the development of the MP44 series of assault rifles was that a smaller cartridge would be less weight for the rifleman to carry, provide sufficient range and sufficient power out to 300 yards, which was where most combat was envisioned to have taken place. So when the first FAL was developed, it was a much smaller gun, and it was in 7mm short. This is a manual showing what the market was envisioned. As you'll notice, this is essentially a sales literature from the factory at FN. As soon as it was received by U.S. Army, it was classified confidential. But it was an interesting period in rifle development. The U.S., Britain, Russia, most countries of the world were seeking both a rifle for themselves domestically and a rifle they could sell overseas. FN, which you remember stands for Fabrique Nationale, was pushing and wanted the 7mm, which is what they'd originally developed the FAL in. But through politics and pressure, the caliber that it eventually evolved into was the .308 that we know today, which is still being produced in South America. FN produced for the United States the T48 series of rifles. T48s were basically the first inch configuration guns. They had somewhat different features than the inch rifles we have today. You can see this is a very nice compact manual. The United States government, when they developed the manual to go along with this rifle, they slightly increased its size and thickness. It was no longer quite a pocket-sized manual for the use of troops. The FN FAL was probably the most successful firearm that FN built. It was eventually adopted by over 80 countries, used on every continent, used in almost every war through the 50s, 60s, 70s, even into the 80s. But the FAL certainly wasn't the only product that FN made. FN, starting the early 1900s, in conjunction with John Browning, produced the 1900 pocket pistol, which turned out to be the most successful pocket pistol. Sold in every country, imitated widely. The Chinese made literally hundreds of different handmade copies. Even through the Vietnam War, there were 1,900 copies made in Vietnamese workshops in the jungle. Nearly all the firearms produced at the FN factory were Browning designs, with the exception, obviously, of the Mauser rifles. After World War I, they continued to produce many of John Browning's designs, various shotguns, the rifles, pump action, 22s, tremendous variety of firearms were produced that were never sold in this country, only overseas. FN itself prospered greatly after World War I. Germany, because of the Treaty of Versailles, was not permitted to sell military-type goods. FN stepped in, managed to land contracts throughout most of South America and many other places of the world. They sold Mauser rifles in almost every caliber imaginable. When World War II came along, FN continued to make firearms, including the Browning High Power and Mauser rifles for the new landlords. After World War II, FN again entered in the market with the FAL. The FAL graduated from the FN-49, sharing the gas system, gas adjustment system, the ability to cut the gas off for grenade firing, or as people now use it for, is to save their brass so they don't have to chase brass around. But they simplified the trigger mechanism greatly over the FN-49. They went to a trigger system which is essentially just like a M1 carbine. As I said before, the original FAL was in 7mm. You're not likely to run across a 7mm. Most of the rifles you're going to run across are in .308. Now we can start with a metric rifle and look for some of the distinctive features of the metric rifle. Metric rifles generally have a cocking handle that is rigid. The sight leaf does not in fact fold, but is rigid. And on a military configuration stock, you'll find that the pistol grip is held on from a screw coming up from the bottom. There are other differences internal, but we'll discuss those when we go into field stripping. An inch rifle has noticeable features: the folding cocking handle, and the front of the receiver rail is cut away here to allow the cocking handle to fold, so it's very smooth. The rear sight has the ability to flip up or flip down. The fact that this stripping latch is vertical and horizontal, they're essentially interchangeable between the models. That's not a problem. Magazine catch on an inch gun is very pronounced. You'll see the large size of the mag catch. And you'll notice on the bottom of the pistol grip, there is no screw. On an inch gun, the screw goes from the top in. Now, an interesting feature on inch rifles is the fact that there's a plate right here you'll notice. For winter use, the screw is removed, the trigger housing is removed, the trigger guard inside the pistol grip, and you essentially can shoot it with a glove on. Hold opens are an interesting feature and always a wonder to people. Why do you have a hold open? It's a real national difference. Most U.S. military guns have always had a hold open. On the FAL, you can have it either way. A FAL can stay open on the last shot or not stay open on the last shot. While the metric version was produced first, the inch came shortly later. Even though they could not agree on a cartridge, except for the .308, each nation started adding features. Just like small cars suddenly become big cars and are no longer compacts. The inch version was adopted by most of the British Commonwealth. Canada, Australia, New Zealand. It was adopted initially by India, and they produced their own version, which is kind of a hybrid between the early metric and inch. Israel adopted essentially the metric rifle, producing many variations, which we'll show you when we go to stripping, to confuse us in this later date. While most FALs had carrying handles, some countries, like New Zealand, chose to not have a carrying handle, as their sergeant majors training troops would say, "It's not a purse, laddie." So they insert essentially a rubber collar where the carrying handle would normally go. So New Zealand rifles that have been issued never have a carrying handle, and that's about the only FAL you're ever going to find without a carrying handle. It's assembled and everything else works the same way. In addition to the military sales that they were seeking for the FN FAL, American Browning brought out a civilian version for the U.S. commercial market. This early manual is actually a standard manual which merely has a piece of paper glued on to indicate that it's semi-automatic. These were also sold with all the early FALs. Later, like most cost-cutting measures, they came out with a small manual, and this is the ones you're most likely to see. If you have a chance to obtain a copy of the early manual, it's very valuable for the illustrations and extra information you have on field stripping and maintenance of the rifle. FN continued to produce the FN FAL at its factory. The first time I went to FN in the 1960s, they were producing not only the FAL rifle, but the Mauser rifles on the same production line. They continued to make it. They changed a number of features to allow easier and less expensive manufacture. It was produced in small runs all the way through into the 70s. Production moved to South America, produced both in Argentina and in Brazil. The inch guns were produced in all the Commonwealth countries, Britain, Canada, Australia. New Zealand never manufactured their own rifles. They used Australian rifles. Most countries phased out production of the FAL rifles in the late 1980s, Australia probably being the last. They are currently only produced in Argentina and Brazil. The FAL was not phased out because of any deficiency in the design, construction, or ability of its performance job as a battle rifle. It lost out to the caliber change to .223, but you're still going to see it for years to come. It was the right arm of the free world, contributed to winning the Cold War. It's hands down one of the best battle rifles ever built. Now we're going to take a look at the design functions. We're going to start with feeding. Now we've taken the top cover off so that you can easily see it. The bolt comes to the rear, starting to press the hammer. You'll see the rounds exposed. Bolt catches, starts around into the chamber. That went a little too fast. We're going to do that again. But you notice the hammer is now cocked. The gun is essentially ready to fire. We're going to go ahead and fire it. Trigger is pulled. Hammer falls. It fires. The gas bleeds off into the gas system. Impacts on the piston. The piston, which extends from here all the way to the face of the receiver. Impacts on the bolt. Now the bolt is going to start to the rear. You can see the round coming out of the chamber. The extractor, in conjunction with the ejector, has kicked the round out. We're going to start forward again. We'll try to do it slower. Well, the round jumped. Okay, I've released the trigger now. The hammer is ready to fall again. I pull the trigger. Hammer falls, impacting on the firing pin. Gas again impinges on the piston. Piston pushes the face of the bolt carrier. The round comes out and is kicked out of the... Now, last round, hold open. This feature was not necessarily universal on FALs. You'll find some FALs with the feature and some FALs without it. We'll show you how to convert it if you need to. So we can manually pull the hold open right here, pull it down, we'll relieve a little tension. There we go. The bolt then is free to fall, and in the case of an inch gun, cocking handle can be folded down. Now we're going to go into a little more detail. I'm going to remove the magazine. We're going to go into the action of the bolt itself. In this condition here, we have the bolt carrier. The bolt is locked. Now, when the bolt carrier starts to the rear, you're going to notice right along here that the bolt is going to start to rise up. Notice that? See how the bolt starts to rise up? We'll do it a couple more times so you can see. Bolt is locked. Bolt carrier starts to the rear, pulls the bolt up and out of engagements, goes to the rear. Now, on the inside, you can see right here, this is the locking shoulder of the weapon. This is one of the few rifles where you adjust headspace with the locking shoulder. The locking shoulders are emplaced. Generally they'll have numbers and codes on them, but it's easiest if you measure them because you may not have access to a table. Now the bolt and bolt carrier come apart. Now one of the things we want to show you is right now you have the bolt carrier locked. You can see the firing pin sticks out so that the hammer can hit it. But as the bolt is unlocked, you'll notice that it immediately clears so the hammer can't strike it. This weapon is very safe in that it's very difficult to have an out of battery condition where the gun will actually fire out of battery. Now, we have the bolt carrier. You have right in here the camming surface in the bolt carrier. Now, on the bolt, you have the camming surface right here. And that's what, in fact, those lift it, and the portion here and the rounded top of the bolt is what pushes it down into the lock position. Now, on this particular bolt, you can see the locking surface. This is a surface that locks against the locking shoulder. And you can always look for wear and inspect for wear here. In the receiver, you have your locking shoulder, the locking surface on the bolt. When it's locked, it's down in that recess. It's a very safe, very well-engineered locking setup because it allows, with wear on the rifle, you can actually adjust the headspace without changing the barrel in the field by merely replacing the locking shoulder. When it's locked, it's in this position. When the bolt carrier picks the bolt up and starts it to the rear, it cams it up over the recess all the way to the rear, at the same time pushing down the hammer. The hammer is actually pushed down by the bolt carrier, so that, again, you have a very safe system of firing pin isolation from the hammer. Now you can see inside the ejector is right here, and here's another difference. On an inch gun, the ejector is integral with the ejector block. On a metric gun, it's actually a replaceable part. Now on a full auto gun, you'll notice right here, the top of a piece, I'm going to move it a little bit so you can see it. That's known as the safety sear. That interacts with the bolt carrier. A bolt carrier on a full auto gun, you'll notice this side is longer than this side. This is the full auto side. Many times you'll find kits, and if you're building up a semi-auto rifle, it is not a bad idea to move this surface back so that both of these are the same length. That way there's no chance. That's why it's a semi-auto. Bolt carrier will have both legs even. Now, in a full auto gun, when this comes forward, this surface contacts your safety sear, pushes it forward, and lifts the rear part here of the safety sear, which engages on the hammer. Now, on the trigger mechanism, you're going to notice here when I engage the sear and I pull back, the sear will go all the way to the rear. You may be able to see the sear movement. So when I pull the trigger, it comes out of engagement, the hammer goes back, but the sear has already popped forward because of the spring. So when the geometry is correct, it catches it. It catches the sear again, and because the trigger is pulled and the way the sear can move, that's the disconnector function. Now the safety acts only on the trigger. Now there's two styles of selectors that you're going to run into. You're going to run into a safety that only has one cut, and that's a semi-auto selector. In the case of a full auto selector, you not only have that cut, when it rotates, you have an additional cut which the semi-auto selector lacks. And what that function allows, when you have the safety in the safe position, there is a solid block on the trigger rear ear, which prevents it from going up. In the fire position, we have this surface exposed, which allows movement of the trigger. On a full auto, when we go all the way to the front, it's thinner. You can look at it, you may be able to see the difference in the thickness on the two sides. The trigger is allowed to go much further so that the sear is totally out of engagement with the hammer, and that's when it's caught on the safety sear. Okay, let's go through the full auto operation one more time. The safety selector allows the rear of the trigger to go up higher than it normally does in semi-automatic, totally clearing the sear out of the path of the hammer sear notch, so that the hammer is totally free to move back and forth. Now, what retains the hammer? The safety sear. Now, what we have is a receiver section here, as we discussed earlier. Here we have the safety sear, full auto sear. This surface engagement right there engages with the front notch of the hammer. We have our sear engagement here. When the bolt carrier comes forward, the other end of the safety sear or the full auto sear rotates under the pressure from the bolt carrier, lifts the engagement out, the hammer is free to fall, then it's returned by the bolt carrier. The sear on the trigger is totally out of engagement, so it immediately comes back and again seats on this notch right here. Now we can show what happens on the top. When I push on the top, you can see the safety sear moves up. Okay, and that surface is this surface right here, which the bolt carrier strikes. When it strikes it, it just moves it forward a slight amount, pulls it out of engagement. The safety sear is released by the bolt carrier. The bolt has been locked. The bolt carrier still has a degree of forward momentum, and that's what strikes this. That means that the gun is fully locked, ready to fire. The bolt carrier trips this, the gun then fires, so that there's no danger of out of battery fire. In a full auto configuration, obviously you need to inspect these parts periodically to ensure their safety. Now let's take a closer look at the gas system. What we have, we're going to use a barrel here so that you can see what it is. You have a normal barrel, you have a gas block is what it's referred to on this rifle. It normally has a front sight. There's a hole from the barrel into this gas cylinder area right here. Now the piston is a standard looking piston. The piston fits right in there, and it goes all the way back to the face of the receiver. When the gun is fired, the gas, after the bullet is passed, the gas bleeds into the gas block. All of the gas immediately contacts the face of the piston. The piston starts to the rear. Now you'll notice that there's a hole in the top of the gas block, and you can see the piston movement as it clears it. This is where gas adjustment takes place. The gas adjustment sleeve on the barrel exposes more and more of this hole, so that if you have the hole totally closed, when the sleeve is fully forward, the hole is covered, you have the maximum amount of gas acting on the piston. The more the sleeve is rotated to expose more and more of the hole, the less gas you have. Now I can show you on the rifle itself. Here's the sleeve we're discussing, and you can see the white of the piston right behind the sight, and you'll notice numbers. Now as I rotate this, you'll see that it closes, Or when I go this direction, it exposes more and more of the hole. That is the gas adjustment. Now, on this particular rifle, you can also cut the gas completely off. If we go slightly, the gas plug itself, to remove it, we can push it in and rotate it. And then it comes out and you'll see the piston is under spring pressure. Okay, one of the things you want to check on the FAL is wear on the face of the piston, and to make certain that you don't have any burring on the gas plug, which would cause for gas leakage. Now you'll notice that this plug is cut in a funny way. We have more exposed on this side than we do on this side. Now the purpose of that is we can totally shut the gas system off in this rifle. Normally that's used for grenade launching, but it can also be used for hand loading. Now we can insert the gas plug one of two ways, with the opening to the bottom so that gas can come out of the barrel and impinge on the face of the piston, or we turn it this way so this side is down and no gas gets to the piston. Now we're going to install it so that the gun will not operate under gas. So we need to turn it. Okay, now in this case we have a smooth top, our ridge is at the bottom, clearly indicating to a user, even in the dark, that this gun is suitable for launching grenades, but it will not in fact cycle. That essentially is the gas system. There's a couple of other things that one should always check on a FAL, because there are so many different combinations of parts that are available. You'll notice on the face of the receiver right here, you can see that the gas piston, which we have right here, is not protruding through, but it's right at the correct surface. So that's how the gas system functions. Now let's take a closer look at the bolt carrier relationships. The bolt is a very robust, straightforward design. You have a fully enclosed bolt face, which well supports the cartridge. You have a narrow cut in the bolt for the ejector. The extractor is a very robust design, carries a wide angle to help in extraction. And now I'm going to show you that we have positive firing pin protrusion. I'm going to push on the rear of the firing pin and you can see that it actually comes through. This is not an inertia firing pin. The hammer actually will rest on the firing pin until the bolt starts to the rear. Now with the bolt, you'll notice you have firing pin rear piece. Now there are one-piece firing pins and there are two-piece firing pins, and you generally will not know which you have until you remove the pin and see which type firing pin you have. Now the bolt carrier we discussed a little bit earlier when we were just discussing the locking surfaces. This one you'll notice has sand cuts. This is out of an inch gun, but they are interchangeable between the two guns. Now you'll notice on the back of the bolt carrier we have what's generally referred to as the rat tail, because that's kind of what it looks like. Now the rat tail, which is on the back of the bolt, contacts the recoil springs in the buttstock. Now we're going to try to see right in the top edge right here is the recess. Now if we go to push, we can see there's a lot of spring pressure on that. That's actually what the rat tail engages into, is that right there. This is the configuration. Now I can try pulling this back, but I don't want to launch this into the camera. You can see that it does. Now this clearance cut right at the top here that we see is so when the gun is closed, it doesn't drag. Now I'll show you that on an actual assembled gun now. Here's an assembled gun. We have the rat tail that's in the recess, and right here on my finger I have the latch. When I pull a latch, the gun is then free to open, and that's the extent it opens. This is normally field stripping right here. Pull a bolt out, you can clean it. Now you'll notice again, when we close it, that same recess, because it's elongated, allows the rat tail to clear and contact the recoil spring. So it's always under spring tension. Generally rat tails are very durable and they don't bend, even though it does look fragile. And that essentially is the major portions of design and functioning of the FAL series rifle. We're now going to disassemble the FAL. The example we have in front of us is an inch pattern rifle, and any differences between the inch and the metric we'll point out as we go along. We can start by taking off the hand guards. There's one screw in the front. You unscrew this screw all the way, the hand guards will come off. When you peel them away, they'll just peel away from the back. The screw will sometimes be retained by a keeper and sometimes not. Now we have the complete gas system exposed at this point. Now, as we did earlier, we're going to remove the gas plug. Push in on the headed side, rotate it 90 degrees, and once you get it in the right place, the spring alone will push it out. The gas piston and its attached spring we can remove. Now, the gas adjustment collar is retained by a spring. The ears on this spring point to the rear. Now what we want to do is come in with a screwdriver, lift one edge of the spring out. You can do it on either side. Once it's off, you can leave it on the gas tube. The adjusting collar then will come off to the rear. Then we have the gas tube itself. Now to remove the gas tube, we're going to have to drive out the pin. Now you can see the pin right below. Now disassembly is quite easy. Assembly is a little bit more important to watch exactly where the placement is. Now the pin is small and you don't want to lose it. Now you should be able to, by hand, unscrew the gas tube from the gas block. If it's difficult, there are two opposing holes, and if you need to, you can take a pin punch through the holes and use them as a wrench. Don't apply too much pressure at that point. Okay, now to remove the rear handguard retaining nut, sometimes these are very tight, especially on metric guns. In many cases you'll find that it'll be necessary to take a pin punch, put it in one of the recesses to loosen it. It's a standard thread, it'll unscrew. Now you can use a wrench, they're available from many commercial sources. They're cut out to fit the nut, and once it's broke loose, you can unscrew it by hand. This also retains the carrying handle. Now you'll notice that this gas tube runs all the way from the gas block to the handguard retaining nut. On some metric guns, you're going to find that it only goes about halfway. And usually on a halfway rod, it may even be silver soldered into the gas block. So if it doesn't come easily, examine it to make sure it's not one of those. Then you can keep all these parts on the gas tube as we unscrew it. I can remove the gas tube and set it aside for later. Now the gas block on the barrel is essentially a factory job. It's not recommended that you take it off or remove it. When you fired a rifle a great deal, you will get some loss of gas, but the gas block is usually the last thing you want to replace. Now this is, again, an inch rifle, and you notice the type sight we have. FAL rifles have all the vertical adjustment in the front sight. Now to remove this front sight, there's a regular flat-plated screwdriver, screw head right in the front. To remove it, you loosen that screw. Okay. You can see that there's a screw right in the front. Now we can use, in this case I'm going to use one of the tools. It's actually the 5-function tool for this rifle. You can loosen the screw. Once you've loosened the screw sufficient, you can take the other end of the tool, which is the front sight tool. It fits over the blade and allows you to loosen the sight. And when you're adjusting the sight for elevation, this is what you have to go through. Otherwise, normal disassembly, you wouldn't need to take the front sight out. Now, back here we now have the carrying handle, and it's only right now retained by friction pressure. So we can just peel it up and out of the receiver, setting it aside. Now what we want to do is we want to separate the upper from the lower. Now we can just take the hinge pin unscrews. Once it's unscrewed, you can just pull it out, and you notice it's a split pin, so that even if it comes unscrewed, it tends to remain. Now sometimes the other half of this is difficult to remove. This one came out very nicely. Now never try to put one together like this. They go together and they're like a Chinese puzzle. They never want to come back apart. Now we're going to separate the upper and the lower. We're going to pull the latch to the rear. The two pieces come apart. Now we're going to finish with the upper. We'll set the lower aside for now. Now the upper, we can merely grasp the back of the top cover, pull it to the rear. Now we'll notice that we were disassembling an inch gun. You'll notice there are tabs on the back here. Now the tabs locate the top cover so it can only go a certain place. The reason they did this on inch guns is there are half covers which allow you to have a stripper clip guide here, and if they didn't have tabs, it would just continue to go back and forth. On a metric gun, you're not going to have the tabs. The bolt comes out quite easily. You grab the rat tail, slides right out to the rear. Not a problem. Now, we have the remaining parts in the receiver. The mag catch and the hold open are retained by the same cross pin. This pin, we merely unscrew the pin, keeping the hole lined up. Okay. Sometimes it's deceptive when it's actually all the way out. Okay. This will pull out by hand. Now you're going to notice on many of them there's a hole through it. At one time they thought they were going to need to wire these in place, safety wire them in place so they didn't come out. That proved not to be necessary. Now the mag catch is under spring tension. So we just want to work it out, and usually the spring, if you're careful, will stay in the mag catch, and that's a good place to leave it. Now what we talked about earlier was about the hold open device. This is the hold open. It rides in the ejector block, and there's the cut in the ejector block for that pin. That pin will move the ejector block. It's acted on by the back of the magazine. When the back of the magazine raises up on the last round, it'll contact the pin if it's long enough. And that's what we're going to check now. When you pull the pin out, most of them, this is a solid one. You can find split pins. You can find many field expedients in this hole. But if you want one to work on a mag hold open, you need to make certain that it's actually long enough to protrude. Now if this one was not long enough, we could take a pin punch, drive it out, put a long enough pin in. This one happens to be long enough. Now all we need to do is we're going to take off the cocking handle, because we do not remove the locking shoulder unless it's absolutely necessary to change headspace. Now this is another small pin. Now the pin is located right beside the rail, and it's fairly easy to get it out. If it wants to come. Okay, once you have the pin driven out, there's a stud that was retained by that pin. Now, sometimes you may have to come inside the receiver where the stud can be reached push on it slightly, the stud will come out. Once you pull the stud out, the cocking handle will go either, you can pull it out the front, you can pull it out the rear. Okay, that completes disassembly of the upper receiver. We'll put that aside. Now, here's our inch lower. Interesting thing about an inch lower, you notice the hammer is cocked. Now, on an inch lower, we put our thumb over the hammer, we pull the trigger, and we control it the whole time, because on an inch gun, this will come loose. That's why they made it in 3 parts, so you didn't have to look for 3 parts. The strut, spring, and the carrier, they sealed it together. On a metric gun, there's a boss on the front of the receiver here that prevents the hammer from going far enough to lose the spring. The safety selector, which comes out next. We rotate it to the vertical position, comes straight out. Then we have inside, we have a retaining plate. If we reach in with our finger and pull the plate out, you can probably see the plate. Now when I pull the first pin out, you can see the purpose of that plate. Okay, you'll notice the pin has a ridge, and that's what interlocks with the plate. So the pins are retained quite well with the plate. You never have to worry about the pins coming out. The sear and the trigger combination comes out the same way. We push it, we pull the pin out, and it also has the same type of pin. Now the interesting thing on the trigger we're going to see is that, lo and behold, it stays together, because on the inch pattern we have a slave pin. Okay, you can see it. I'll push it back and forth so you can see there's a slave pin. Without that slave pin, those of you who put together carbine triggers will remember that sometimes it takes a little time. Now the pin, we can put the pin back in the trigger and keep it. This plate stays in the receiver. It's riveted. Okay, now we can take off the pistol grip. You'll notice, as we said earlier, on an inch gun, you have a screw from the top on the pistol grip. If this was a metric gun, the screw would be from the bottom. On the new type guns that have the thumb hole stocks, it usually is not present. Now the screw, we're going to loosen the screw. Okay, now the pistol grip. I don't think the screw came all the way out yet. Okay, there's the screw. Notice it has a star washer on it. Star washer is obviously to keep it from coming loose. Now the pistol grip is retained in 2 ways. It's not only the screw, you'll notice there's a shouldered stud which interlocks with the wood on the pistol grip. So that what we have is a very secure mounting, not only physically, but with the screw in addition. Now, as we said earlier, this gun is kind of unique and it has its own winner trigger. When you take the bottom screw out of the trigger guard, and by the way, this is a machine screw, so don't get it mixed up with the wood screw that we're going to take off next. Sometimes this doesn't want to pop easily. You can use a pin punch and rotate it out. Then you take the trigger guard, you'll see the recess. Trigger guard goes in there and you can reassemble this, and you no longer have a trigger guard, so it's perfectly suitable for winter use. Now we'll take this back off, put the screw back in here so we don't lose it. This pistol grip consists of 14 parts. It was probably designed by a government agency in Australia, R&N. Now we're going to take off the trigger return spring. You'll notice this is what actually provides the impetus to the trigger to return. Now there are actually semi-auto and full auto trigger return plungers, but over the years they've gotten mixed up quite a bit. Now this is a wood screw, so when you take this out, be real careful because you don't want to damage the wood by over tightening when you put it back together. Now this plate will come off and we're going to find we have the trigger return spring, trigger return plunger, and the plate. Now this goes back together essentially the same way. But again, because it's a wood screw, I want to be careful about over tightening and stripping the threads in the wood. Okay. Now we have remaining on the gun, we have the rear sight. Now the rear sight, as you notice, this one flips, so it's an inch. Metrics will stay up. Now, we have a screw on this side, and we have a screw on this side. That's to get our lateral adjustment in the rear sight. Now, either screw can be removed. Now, when you turn these, you can probably even hear the ratchet mechanism. There is an S-spring underneath the sight which provides our click adjustment. Okay, you can remove that screw, then the rear sight will usually come off by hand. They're usually not that tight. Okay, now we saw the little spring. Here's a little spring that provides our detent. Okay, and when it's in the base of the rear sight, you can see how it sticks through, and the screws have serrations around the inside edge. So when you adjust the sights, they interact with the spring, and you get a positive click. And the sights generally do not wander. Okay, if you need to take off the slider, this front pin will come out. You can see the pin coming, but it's kind of small. We don't want to lose it. Okay, because most of these parts are concrete soluble, and you drop them, and they're gone forever. Now we're going to do this upside down so that the spring stays in its position. Okay, now we're just going to slide it as soon as I get it. Okay, slide it back in. Okay, take the screw, and again you can take off either side. It doesn't matter. Now, a foul sight sometimes is looser than you think it should be. Either in the, generally in the slider. As you can see, this one, the base is not moving, but the slider is. If you're trying for match accuracy, there's a number of ways that you can try to tighten the sight up. You can peen it, you can add material, any number of acceptable ways to try that. Okay, now the buttstock is removed in a fairly straightforward fashion. This is an inch gun. We've got a screw at the top and a screw at the bottom. A Canadian inch gun is only going to have a center screw. So, you know, it's important to kind of look real close before you start taking things apart. You'll notice this one has a butt trap, and Canadian C1s don't have a butt trap. Now, when we pull this screw, we notice that it's a machine screw, and the rear swivel is on a stud. Very similar to the M1 Garand, the M16. Okay, now the upper screw is not a machine screw. Again, it's a wood screw. Okay, then the butt plate will generally lift straight off. Now you notice that we've got several recesses here. The recess that matches up with the butt plate for the thong kit. Now we're faced with an interesting looking screw. Okay, now this screw right here retains both the buttstock and the recoil spring. Now these screws are essentially the same on both inch or metric, wherever they are. Okay, here's the buttstock removal tool. You notice that it has a screwdriver blade on the heavy part of the shank and a guide rod for the spring. Now if you don't have one of these, you need to think a little bit before you take this apart. First, you need to make sure that the screw is broken loose with a screwdriver, but you do not want to take much of it out. Okay, this one is now loose. If you don't have a tool like this and you need to control this spring, use something like an M16 cleaning rod, insert it just like I'm inserting this one, so that you can control that spring, and then using a small screwdriver work around the edge, because when this comes off, there's a spring tension. Okay, now we're unscrewing it. You can always think about a lot of things when you're unscrewing a screw like this with a good spring behind it. First time you do this, it's kind of interesting because you didn't realize how much force there was on this spring. Actually, there's two springs, an inner and an outer, but we just call it a spring, even though there actually are two of them. Yep, see, there it comes. Okay, now we can pull our tool out, and we'll show you what's actually in here. Okay, first we have the retaining screw that we were taking around. There's a washer on it. Okay, now what sometimes makes it difficult is the inside of this hole is threaded. In some locations, for some climatic reasons, they will seal this with another screw. And if you find one like that, you need to take out the center screw first. Once that's done, then you can pull out the recoil spring assembly. It consists of an inner and an outer spring and the plunger. And if you remember, this is what matches up with the rat tail. Okay, we can set that aside. Now, we have one screw left that holds the buttstock on. Here again, it's a wood screw, not a machine screw. So unscrew this screw. Okay, now the buttstock sometimes sticks and takes a minute to break loose. Okay, now what we see is we have the recoil spring tube, which is attached to the receiver. The stock is now completely devoid of any of the metal fittings. Now, this removal is not recommended. I don't recommend that you remove the recoil spring guide tube. It's both swaged and there is a gauge when you do install it that has to be aligned, so it's better not to remove it. Now, the last part in here is the lock. This is the front part of the lock that locks onto the bottom of the receiver. You'll see that there is a plunger and a cross pin. Now we want to remove the latch pin assembly. We have to drive the pin out. It's a cross pin. Okay. Now this is also under spring tension. So as we get to the other side, we're going to watch because the pin is going to come out. Now we have the plunger under spring pressure. Now we're going to remove slowly so that it hits our finger and doesn't leave too bad of a blood blister. Okay, now because you can see that's a fairly strong spring. Okay, now the plunger, you'll notice it's still not wanting to come out. Okay, the plunger is attached. There is a tiny screw at the base here which we need to remove in order to pull the latch itself, so then the plunger will come out. We're now going to remove the screw so we can remove the latch lock lever. Okay, the screw in here is not necessarily easy to get at. We'll unscrew it. Okay, now the screw comes out. Now we can lift the latch lever. I'm going to push on this side with your finger, lift it right up, comes directly out, and this is the lever that interlocks with the plunger. Now this plunger is very important because this is actually what retains the upper receiver in the lock position. This bottom surface here is what interacts with the receiver. We can go on and we'll disassemble the bolt. Many times on a bolt, to get it out of the carrier, you'll need to push on the back of the firing pin for clearance. Okay, now the bolt, we can push forward on the firing pin, just like that. The pin comes out quite easily. Pull the pin out, and in this case, because we ended up with a short piece, we have a two-piece firing pin. Okay, you can see the firing pin spring, these surfaces here, and this is where the lock pin goes right through there. Okay, now the extractor, there's actually a field tool for this, which we don't have. Okay, the bolt to disassemble the extractor, the plunger needs to come to the rear, and the extractor will come up and out. Then the plunger and its spring will come out. Now you can see there's a fairly good recess there for the extractor, and those of you who have been around BARs will notice the similarities with a BAR. Another Browning product. And that completes disassembly of the FAL. I want to cover some of the aspects of cleaning individual parts now. Because of the concern for the environment and your hands, there's a number of cleaners on the market that are not petroleum based. Simple Green is one. There's various other ones that are available. You can put your parts that you want to clean into a cookie sheet. Try not to pick one of your favorite ones. Merely just spray the parts. You can let them soak. You can use a toothbrush to take, if you get edges, small corners, things like that, you can take a toothbrush. When the parts are clean, you can put them in a bucket, rinse them, get all of the detergent off. They're going to be wet, so you're going to want to dry them. Now, you can use an oven on a very low temperature. Put your parts in the oven, let them dry. When you're ready to lubricate the dried parts, you can put them in a clean cookie sheet with a towel. You can hose them down with a brake free. Okay. Then you can take and rub the brake free into the metals. The Teflon will coat it. It's an excellent time. You can feel any burrs, notice any problems. It's a last final inspection. The corrosion resistance qualities of the brake free is really good, not only on internal parts, but your external parts. When the parts have been totally dried, you're going to be ready for reassembly. Okay, we're going to reassemble the FAL now, but I want to show a couple of tools that we used and didn't necessarily identify. Right here we have the Australian 5-function tool. You've got 2 screwdriver blades, one for the front sight, one will take apart the pistol grip and the other parts. You have this slit section here, which we showed is for adjusting the front sight. And on this section right here, we have the same cut that we have on the Israeli tool and the same cut we have on the Belgian tool. That's to take apart the retaining nut for the carrying handle, and you can use it for gas adjustment. So we'll be using those during the reassembly process. Okay, the first part we're going to reassemble is the bolt. Now when you take a look at the extractor, you can see that it's a fairly well designed extractor. You have a large surface that'll ride up and over the cartridge. You have a very nice and very thick extractor claw, and it's not like a spring steel extractor, some of the smaller extractors you may be used to. What you're going to find is that it is radius to fit the cartridge, so that you do not have a lot of chance of pulled in half cartridges or any of the other problems associated with rifles. Okay, when you inspect your extractor, you want to make sure that the claw is complete through its whole radius. You want to make sure there's no nicks. And when you look at the back side, it should be 90 degrees to the body. Now this is very difficult to file if in fact you have a bad extractor. You might try using a Dremel wheel, something of that nature. Otherwise, it's better to go ahead and get a new extractor. They're cheap, readily available. You know, it's an ideal spare part to keep around. Now there's very few things to go wrong with the extractor. The spring, you'll notice you always want to make sure that it sets so that you have a fair amount of protrusion when it's just setting there. It's under spring tension now, so you have a fair amount of protrusion. To reinstall it, make sure that the 2 pieces made up. If you have an extractor tool, it'll lock on the back and pull the plunger back. But if you don't have one, you're going to need to pull it back at the same time you get your extractor in here and push back. Okay, there we go. Now, as you're probably going to realize, this spring is under a lot of spring pressure. One of the tools that's ideal is like a Starrett punch. When you break one of these, make it into a drive punch, and it'll fit in the recess and actually make the job fairly straightforward and fairly easy. Now we can pop the firing pin in. Now remember, in this case, we had a 2-piece firing pin. Sometimes you'll have a single, and it'll be a 1-piece firing pin. You get the front part in. You want to make sure you get the lined up. Have your pin. So you put your pin in. Push the firing pin extension in. Take your pin. Drop it right on through. Make sure you seat it. Okay? Firing pin is in, extractor is in. Then we take the bolt carrier, take your bolt, seat the firing pin. Usually it falls right in. Okay? We'll set that aside. Now we're going to reassemble the lower. First part we need is the plunger. Okay? Goes into the hole. Okay? Then we take our lever. Large part of the lever goes right in the bottom hole. Now we want to make sure when we get in there that we're mating up. So now you can see that the plunger goes back and forth. Now what we're going to do is put the spring in. Before we put the spring in, we want to make sure that it's lined up so we can put the pin in later when we go to put the pin in. Now we're going to take this, and the metal plunger goes forward. Okay? That goes in. Now what we want to do is we want to take a pin punch that's about the diameter of the spring, okay? And we're going to use that to push it in. Okay? Now what we're going to do is at the same time we're going to push the spring in. It's a little bit tricky to get everything lined up at once. Okay, we got the pin in. We're going to take our pin, start it through our hole to catch the spring. Okay, now what we want to do is finish driving the pin across, and we'll seat it with another punch. Okay, make sure you want it in each side about the same amount. Okay, then we can take our lock, which we had before, goes in the screw hole. Now this is what actually retains the latch on the outside. Okay, we're going to screw that in. Okay, when you're putting the final tension on the screw, it does not have to be anything more than just snug. Okay, you can run it up so it's snug. Now our latch is complete and assembled. Now we can take our buttstock. Now we have the recoil spring tube and the stock. One of the things you want to look for is make sure that there's no dents or any other imperfections which will drag on the spring. The stock can get tight and fits on. Then we have the wood screw that we put in the bottom, which retains on the bottom. Okay. Now, our recoil spring, want to make sure there's no kinks in it. Okay, this one looks fine. This is one of the areas that we want to make sure we take careful attention as far as lubrication. Brake free, any of the other lubricants are quite good on this. Okay, and put the recoil spring in. Now, we go back to our buttstock assembly tool. We take the retainer, slide it over. It'll match up. Okay, now we feed the spring into the shaft, into the lower, get a couple of good turns on it. Okay, and then just tighten it down. Okay, here again, when you're bringing it up tight, it does not have to be. Okay, you've got short handles on it. You don't need to put a cheater or anything. Okay, that's assembled. Now we can take our butt plate, insert our butt plate, wood screw in the top, screw it down. Remember, it's just a wood screw. It does not have to be torqued quite tight. Now we have our bottom swivel with a stud. That goes into the wood. Machine screw goes back. Now at this point, sometimes it hits first time. You want to try to tighten this with your hand. Okay, start it with your hand. It's in. Screw it down. Okay? Now we want to put our internals back in. Okay? We can take our trigger guard, it catches at the top, slips right in. We take our machine screw, start it by hand, it's always safe. Here again, these do not have to be super tight. Run it right in. Okay? Now we can take it and we're going to hook the front of the guard into the receiver, bring it around, the stud fits right on. Then we have our screw with a star washer. Goes through the recess. Take our screwdriver and tighten it down. The screw goes into a metal bushing in the wood. So here again, you don't want to tighten it too tight. It'll tighten and be sufficiently tight. Okay? Now, we want to put our trigger sear combination. Now remember we said this already has a slave pin on it. If you need to take it out, you can push the slave pin out and it's just a standard pin. Now we have the trigger pin. Now the pins go in. Remember, because we have a retaining plate inside, want to make sure that it's up. Now sometimes when you're putting the trigger pin in, you're pushing against the trigger return spring in the pistol grip. Okay, your pin goes through, comes through on this side. Okay? Then we take our hammer and our hammer pin. Now you'll notice that there's a remains of some grease on this surface. And we'll discuss that more when we're assembling the gun. We'll show you some of the necessary things about greasing the FAL. Now what we want to do is take the hammer, and we're going to have to push against the sear slightly to give us some room. Here again, the hammer pin will come through this side. Now, we can rotate the plate down into the receiver, and it will lock the two pins, the hammer and the trigger pin in. Now we take the selector safety. You'll notice there's a tit on it and a corresponding cut in the receiver, so it goes in vertically, and you'll push it against the tension of the spring plunger, rotate it down, and it's installed. Now, at this point, inch and metric are slightly different. We said earlier, this is an inch hammer return spring assembly. On a normal metric gun, you have this part called the plunger, you have the spring, and you have the cup housing, all three parts. But on the inch gun, it's an assembly, and it was done that way because it'll come out this way. You only have to hunt for one part. Okay? The lower is completely assembled now. Now let's go ahead and reassemble the upper. Now we can one of the first things we want to do before we put the gas tube in, okay, on the gas tube you'll notice that there are two slots. The flats that the pin goes against is right across the flats where the slots are. Okay? Now the one thing we want to do is you want to actually visually look through this to make sure there's no burrs raised and everything is smooth. Once you're assured that everything is fine there, you can start it in. You can put the handguard retaining nut, you can start that, and then you can start the other end. Now keep in mind that these threads, if you do one at a time, you'll sometimes start the other one out. So you want to screw this one in a ways, and then you want to get the front gas tube You want to screw it in. Now this is not to be screwed in tight. Now notice I'm only using finger pressure and it stopped at that point. Now you can see that's where one of the holes is. Now the holes need to be horizontal. Okay, when we do that, we can look through the hole where the pin goes. You have right here the hole for the gas pin that retains the tube. Now there's a flat there. Now that flat also corresponds when the two holes are horizontal. Okay, now we're going to put that pin in. Okay, when it gets pretty close to being seated, I'm going to make sure that the gas tube is still free to turn. You don't want that pin to bind on the tube, because what it'll do is it will raise a surface on the inside that will interfere with the movement of the piston. Now once it's down far enough, you can take the gas adjusting sleeve and slide it on. Here again, you want to make sure that it's free. Okay? You rotate it through its whole movement pattern to make sure it's free. Then our small retaining spring, we can slide it forward and snap it up onto the, okay. Once it's in the right spot and seated, okay, you can try your movement again. Okay. Now, it's not a bad idea to leave this sleeve where you have the least amount of gas. If you don't get a chance to adjust it and you shoot it, you're not going to do any damage to the gun. Okay? Now we're going to put the handle in. Now the handle is a friction fit. Now sometimes it goes in easy and sometimes it goes in hard. Now what you want to do is get it aligned. Okay? And then start turning the retaining nut in. Sometimes you may have to jiggle the handle a little bit to seat it right in the proper space. This can be turned in by hand. Now for final tightening, if you don't have a 5-function tool with a slot that fits, or a Belgian style one, or an Israeli style one, okay, you can take a pin punch and very carefully in one of the recesses put the punch, hit it lightly with a hammer. This does not need to be very tight. Snug is fine. Okay, now we're going to assemble mag catch, hold open, and the rest of the parts that go in the ejector block. Now on the hold open, you'll notice that there's a spring. Now when you put the cross pin through, okay, you're going to be above that because the spring tension on this holds it down. Okay? So now when we go to put these in, you're going to take the hold open device, it goes in its recess, and you want to make sure that it's always free. Here again, this is a good place for break free. Okay? Make sure it's free. Now, the magazine catch, here again, this is an inch style magazine catch. You'll notice that it seems inordinately large for the job. Most metric mag catches will only be this portion right here. They will not have this extension that goes around to the other side. Okay? Now, the recess is here. Mag catch will slide in, and you can have your choice of how you do this, but if you can do it in such a way that you can find the spring when it shoots out and gets lost, it's very helpful, because sometimes it'll go places that only springs can go. Now we want to take our axis pin. Now the axis pin, the shaft of this is another good place for break free. Okay? Now here's what we're going to try to do is, you notice I got my finger on the cross pin, and I'm going to play a little bit with, there it goes, with the with the hold open. Now you see I push down and it pops up, so it's in and it's free. Now all I have to do is get it through the mag catch, keeping a little bit of pressure. I want to move the mag catch around. You felt it? Okay. Then we can screw the axis pin in. And here again, you notice I'm using a small screwdriver. It's not necessary to put a great deal of torque on any of these screws, okay? Snug is fine. Now we can recheck it. Our mag catch, our hold open, okay? Now we can put our cocking handle in. Now, remember we said this is a inch style. It's got a folding cocking handle, and there's a recess right here for this to fold to. Now we can slide it in. We can slide it in from the back, or we can slide it in from the front. Now we have our stud. Now the stud, the inner end of the stud, is what contacts the bolt carrier and pulls it to the rear. Stud goes in. Want to make sure it's seated all the way. Then we have the very small pin. Okay. Now that we have the pin in, we're merely going to drive the pin in flush. Okay, the pin is flush. Push the cocking handle forward, it folds down. Okay, now we're going to put the gas piston in. I mean, take a look at your gas piston. Notice that this one is flat, shiny, has sharp edges all the way around the edge. Okay, those are the things you want to look for. Okay, now the piston goes in. Okay, perform the same inspection on your gas plug. Make sure that the back is flat, that there's no burrs, and that the edges all the way around are sharp. Now we're going to put the gas plug in. Don't forget there's spring tension on the gas piston. Okay, when you push the gas piston in, remember there is tension on the spring. Okay, push in the catch, the gas piston is in. Now on your handguard ring, you want to make sure it is back to the rear. Take your handguard, it'll slip in the back, go to the front. The other side, which has the screw, catch it in the back handguard cup. Then the screw will go right through the hole here in the front of the gas block. Okay, it's in. Here again, screw in the screw. Okay, there you have your handguards back on. Now, before you put your bolt in, you want to take a look. The surfaces you want to put either the special grease, Lubriplate, something like that that has high adhesion qualities. You want to put it across this area, because if you look, you can see, or you possibly can see, the amount of shine that comes from it opening, when it opens, pushing the hammer down each and every time. So that's a good surface for Lubriplate or the Australian Army grease. The locking shoulder, you can put the grease there, and the cam surfaces on each side of the bolt carrier, other areas that you want to take care of lubing. The rails, you can use Lubriplate, but probably you'll be better off to use the brake free. Now when you take your bolt, you want to hold it in such a way that you've got your thumb pushing forward on this, lay the bolt on the receiver, the rails on the top, the rails on the bolt carrier. Okay, now you want to make sure when you push this in that it totally is easy to slide. There's no binding. Okay, that's because it falls. There's no pressure on it. Okay, you see that it goes back and forth, finger pressure, no problem at all. Okay, your top cover, here again, we've got an inch top cover here with the tabs on the back. If it was metric, it wouldn't have the tabs. Easiest way to put it in is catch this side because the rail is longer. Catch this side, rotate it down, catch the other side on this side, and there again, it slides right on. Okay? Now let's take a minute before we put the lower on to cover some of the points that we should lubricate on the lower. Obviously, the shafts on the hammer pin and the trigger pin, good place for break free, okay? The surfaces on the top of the hammer that engage the bolt carrier, again, you should use Lubriplate or the Australian Army grease. Now, as you remember in the cleaning process and lubricating process, we lubricated all this with break free to begin with. But this is just in case you wanted to do a small cleaning or only field strip. Those are the areas you should pay attention to. Now, remember earlier when we discussed the locking plunger in the lower. Where that mates is this surface right here, the upper part of this surface. And this is an important area to watch for when you're building a gun, and we'll discuss that when we get to the building. But this is the lug we're talking about, and that is the plunger, okay? Now to reassemble the upper to the lower, you merely slip it on so the holes match up. There is no rule about which side this goes on. It is simply a convention. Some people put it on from one side and some people put it on for the other. But functionally, there's no difference. Now, this goes on. You screw it on. Again, since we lubed this from when we cleaned it, there'll be Lubriplate or break free on the axis pin. Now, we can work the action, pull it to the rear, release it. Safeties checks good. Put it to the fire, holding the trigger to the rear. We're going to operate it one more time. Release the trigger. You'll be able to feel the sear pop back into its place. Okay, so we know the disconnector is working. Okay, that's the safety checks. The magazine. Put the magazine back in the gun. Okay, so now we have our FAL completely reassembled. We've safety checked it, and it's ready to go in the rack or to the range. Okay, in this section what we're going to do is show you how to build a FAL. One of the most important things when you're building a FAL is to determine whether you've got inch parts or metric parts. And we're going to do a little review. If you remember when we disassembled the L1A1, the inch lower, when we pulled the trigger, we needed to control the hammer because the hammer spring will come loose. Okay? Now, on a metric, we do the same thing. We pull the trigger, and whoops, the hammer stops. Very key identification feature. The hammer stops, the spring is still held captive. Okay? Now, on the pistol grip, for an inch gun, the screw came in from the top. On the metric gun, which we now have, you can see the screw goes in from the bottom. Another key identification feature. Okay? Remember, this is an inch. We got the screw in the top. Now, another identification feature is the rear swivel. On this inch gun, we have a stud with a screw, which is very similar to M1, M14, M16. On a metric lower, what we have is we have an inset swivel. And this will almost always be the case on a metric gun. Okay? Now, a metric lower, an inch lower, will interchange as an assembly on either style receiver. Okay? Now, barrels are a problem. They're important. Now, what we have here is an inch barrel. Okay? And you'll notice there are serrations right around this gas block area. That is a good identification feature that you'll find on inch barrels. Okay? Now, the thread on an inch barrel is essentially 1 inch, 16 threads per inch. Okay? Now, let's take a look at a metric barrel. A metric barrel, what we've got, we have threads for the same style of adjusting sleeve, but it's different. It's threaded here. Okay? The barrel threads are essentially 1 inch, 16 threads per inch. So these barrels will fit inch or metric receivers. There are differences in how we treat the shoulder, which we'll cover when we get to the actual building of the guns. Now, here is a barrel which we've painted red. Yours won't be painted red when you get it. This is an Israeli thread barrel. Now, normally only Israeli heavy barrels, some light barrels, and all Indian FAL barrels
have the same thread. They're a combination. Well, notice we have an inch feature here, which is the serration so that we can feel it in the dark, okay? We'll show you later how to correct the threads on this so you can use an Israeli heavy barrel on an inch receiver or a metric receiver, okay? Now before we do receivers, I want to show you magazines. What we have here, we have a big heavy lug and we have a notch that's actually knocked out of the parent material, okay? This is the metric mag, small tit on the front of the mag. The inch mag, we have a very heavy plate. These mags are always used in inch guns. As the Argentines found out in the Falklands War, the Brits could take their metric mags from the Falkland soldiers and put it in their inch guns, and the Argentines couldn't do that. Okay, we're going to cover receivers now and the differences so that you can tell the difference between an inch and a metric receiver. First, we're going to take a true metric receiver. This receiver is currently manufactured in Brazil by Embel. It's a high-quality receiver. It's imported by Pacific Armament and sold by various dealers in the States. Some of the features that you want to see on a metric receiver. The rail for the cocking handle goes all the way to the front. You'll notice it goes the full length. Another feature of a true metric receiver is the fact that you have the small notch in the front for the metric mag, which we've always shown you how to identify the metric mag. Okay, those are the basic features of a metric receiver. Now there will be cosmetic differences you may find depending on the age of the receiver. There may be a lightning cut in this area. This contour here may be different, but if it has the small magazine catch and the full length cocking slot, it's a true metric receiver. Now obviously this true metric receiver will take a metric barrel with no work. Now, what will happen if we take an inch barrel? This is a brand new Australian barrel. We're going to turn it into a metric receiver, and you'll notice it's screwing right in. Okay, now, here's the interesting point. You'll notice that there is a gap between the receiver and the barrel. And this gap, in the case of an inch barrel, is always taken care of with a breeching washer, which we'll show you when we go through the actual building of the gun. Okay, now let's take a look and see what an inch receiver's like. Okay, this is a true inch receiver. It was made in Australia. This one happens to have the lightning cut, which we discussed, and notice the contour is different, but those are not the key features. What we have is a key feature. The cocking slot stops before it gets to the receiver ring. This is what allows the folding cocking handle on an inch gun to fold flat. Now, in addition, when we discussed magazines, what we saw was the magazine for an inch gun requires a much larger recess for the magazine catch. And those are the identifying features for an inch receiver. With an inch receiver, it will obviously take an inch barrel. And as we just showed, with a metric receiver and an inch barrel, it's screwed right in. And the opposite would be true here. With an inch receiver, we could use a metric barrel. The differences in breeching we'll discuss when we actually build the rifle. Now what we'd like to do is take an Israeli barrel. Again, it's painted red, but yours probably won't be. Now we're going to screw it into this receiver. And you'll notice it starts quite easily. I'm only using hand pressure and it goes in. But you're going to see that it stops and gets very difficult. And it's still a quarter of an inch out. This is an easy way to tell that it's an Israeli barrel or an Indian Ishapur barrel. It stops about a quarter of an inch out. And later when we go to building, we're going to show you how to correct that so you can use it in an inch or a metric receiver, either the Israeli or an Indian barrel. Now we're going to show you some differences, some hybrid receivers. You'll find barrels and receivers will screw into a lot of different receivers as we've just shown. Now this receiver here has the small notch, has a long cocking handle slot, so you'd normally figure it's a metric receiver. And in this case, you know, those are the only features that count. This receiver, because of the features we've shown, is a metric. Even though it's not labeled metric, it can be used to build metric kits. This is an inch style receiver that's made in this country, and it has lightning cut. It has the large magazine recess, and we can see that the cocking handle stops so that you in fact have an inch receiver. Now there were receivers that were made that actually take the Israeli thread. Now this receiver is not marked in any way to indicate that. Okay? Looks like a conventional metric receiver, but when you screw into the receiver an Israeli heavy barrel or an Indian barrel, it goes in and you breech it in the normal way. You do not have the 1/4 inch gap. They make an identical receiver with metric threads. So you need to check what kind of a barrel you have and what kind of a receiver you have.
Warning: before building a fowl from a kit, contact the BATF for current regulations. Certain individual parts or parts combinations may be illegal.
Now in this case we've ordered an L1A1 kit. When your kit arrives, you're going to have a pile of parts. Now you're going to get the complete lower assembly, trigger housing, buttstock, all of these parts. Okay? Now you've disassembled this already. You know exactly what's going on. There's no mystery here. Okay? You're going to get your bolt and your bolt carrier. It may not be together. It may be in two different packages, but you get the complete bolt and bolt carrier. You get the center section of the rifle, which has the magazine catch, the hold open, the cocking handle, the access pin. You'll also have a locking shoulder that's installed. That locking shoulder may or may not work for your configuration. Okay? You're going to get the complete barrel assembly. Okay? All of the gas system, the hand guard, and in this case you'll notice that literally what they did, they just cut the rifle off. And actually that's a benefit to you because nobody else has damaged the barrel. You may or may not get a magazine. Now, first problem we have to do is we have to get this bit of receiver off of the barrel that we're going to use. So you disassemble this exactly as you've been shown before. You'll end up with a barrel assembly. You want to take the gas system off because when you put this in a barrel vise, most barrel vices do not accommodate a gas tube. So you put this in the barrel vise. You can, in this case, it looks like somebody's already tried to take it off with a bar or something. You'll take this piece of receiver off your barrel. Then what you'll end up with is a totally stripped barrel, ready to go into a receiver. Now, let's take a look. Here's a receiver. We ordered this receiver, okay? And in this case, we're using inch and inch. One of the first things we want to do, after we've cleaned the threads, made sure that the threads on both receiver and barrel are fine. On an inch gun, we want to take the barrel, screw it into the receiver by hand, and we're going to find out something here, that actually it goes beyond top dead center. You can see that the barrel and the receiver, it's gone too far. It's actually gone beyond top dead center. Okay? Now, that's because, if you'll notice here, there's the gap we talked about when you have an inch barrel. Regardless of the receiver goes on, there's going to be a gap. Now that gap is filled with a breeching washer. And obviously these washers are available in many different thicknesses. About 10 of them are standard. Now what we want to do is we want to take our barrel back out. Now we know that it does what it's supposed to. It goes beyond top dead center. That means that the threads are fine, and it means that the face of the barrel does not contact the inside of the receiver abutment area. Okay? So now we take a washer. The first washer we try may or may not work. Then by hand again, we screw the barrel in. What we want is about 15 degrees before top dead center. Okay? Now, in this case, what we've got is it's a little bit loose. What we want to do is unscrew it and go to the next size washer up so that where we want to strike is about, okay, here would be 90, here would be 45. We're looking at something around 15 degrees. You're going to want to go to the barrel vise, clamp your barrel in the barrel vise, and put a form-fitting receiver wrench on the receiver. Now, you may not have this. You may have to farm this work out, but it's necessary. You cannot put the receiver in a machinist vise, no matter how big it is, and use a pipe wrench on the barrel. The receiver has to be supported all the way around the receiver ring, and you can only do that with a form-fitting wrench. Once the barrel is in the receiver, vertical, everything is done, you're ready to headspace, and that involves the shoulder. Okay, now we're going to cover actual head spacing. And as you remember, I want to repeat it again, the barrel needs to be in a barrel vise, okay? Something that's going to grip the round surface. The receiver needs to be well supported. As an example, here's a receiver wrench that is actually contoured to fit the receiver and support it in this receiver ring area. You must do that, okay? Otherwise, you take a real chance on ruining the receiver. And if you don't have the specialized equipment, that's a job you should farm out, okay? Now we're going to head space it. Your chamber will have been cleaned. Okay, now you take a headspace gauge. Now you notice these headspace gauges don't have a rim on them. This is a commercial gauge. It has a rim all the way around, just like the cartridge would. These can be purchased from places like Forrester, Brownells, places like that. The military style gauges you can purchase from surplus dealers. Okay, we're going to put the headspace gauge in. We're going to take our clean bolt. We're going to slide it in. Okay? Now, easily closes because we don't have a locking shoulder yet. Now what we're going to determine is what the actual dimension required for the locking shoulder. Now, if you remember, you're not going to be able to see in this hole, but can you remember from this assembly, there's a flat area on the back of the bolt that's the locking surface. What we're actually going to be measuring is from the back round area here to the bolt locking surface, okay? Now, in our case, we're going to use a set of actual rods. Now, these rods are marked with the locking shoulder numbers, and they're contoured the exact same way that a locking shoulder. Let me show you what we're looking here, okay? Here's a locking shoulder, and there's the gauge. You're going to see that they're contoured the same. They have a flat on top for bolt clearance, and they have the cut on the front that the actual locking surface. This is the actual locking surface. Now, these are available in a lot of different sizes, okay? The reason for that is, as the rifle wears, headspace wears, the bolt stretches, the receiver stretches, you take care of that with various sizes of lugs. Now, over here I have a whole set of locking shoulders. We have a first oversized, second oversized, third oversized. But this is a new receiver, so more than likely we're going to be able to use first series locking shoulder. Now what I'm going to do is take our rod. I'm going to pull the bolt back just slightly as I insert the rod. Now what I want to find is a place, okay, notice I've got space up here. It's not closing, so I need to pull it out further, going to a smaller locking shoulder. Okay, it seats. Notice it's seated. Okay, I'm going to move it over. Okay. This is about where I want it right here. Okay? Now, you're going to do your determination in a slightly different way. Okay? You can see the rod is sticking through. The distance you're going to actually be measuring with your tool is from this surface here, which is where the bolt strikes against, and to here. Okay? Now, you're going to do that with either, you can use a drill shank, you can use a small hole gauge, you can use dowel pins, whatever you need that'll physically fit in here, and you're going to measure from this distance to this distance, okay? Now we have our dimension, okay? Now I'm going to check it so I don't have to trust the number. Okay, our dimension is 275.275, okay? Now, I've got several locking shoulders set out here. Now, again, I'm going to be measuring from the flat to the back rear curved surface. You can see, okay, that's what I'm measuring, from the back curved. Okay, this one is a little bit too small. Okay, this one's a little too small. Okay, we're getting closer. Okay, here's the one I need, 275. Okay, now I'm going to pull my bolt and bolt carrier out of the receiver. Take my headspace gauge out. Okay, now what I'm going to do is install the gauged hole that we've done. Now, first thing you want to do, you want to make sure that there's a recess there, right? And you have the same shape on your lug. You want to make sure that that actually fits in that hole. Okay, that one fits pretty good. Okay, sometimes you may have to trim a little bit, very fine files. You don't want to take material off. You especially don't want to take material off your locking surface. Only we're here, okay? Now, in most cases with a new receiver, you can use a 0 series locking shoulder, okay? Now we're going to install this. It can be installed in a number of different ways. You can put it in using a hydraulic press, which is what the factory uses, okay? You can also, if you don't have a hydraulic press, you can use a manual press. Okay, now what we want to make sure when we're doing this is that the receiver itself is supported on the back, okay? We want to make sure that we've got this vertical, and we want to just take it and tap it in. Now you'll notice, you probably heard the sound difference. It went through the first side quite easy. Now, a lot of times you can move it by hand. What you want to do is get it down, okay, and you want to make sure that it's lined up with the hole, okay? Remember, we made sure that it was going to fit before. So we want to line this up so that it's going to fit. Now the other area that we should take care of is, in many cases, it has to go through the other side now, okay? It never hurts to take a pin punch and lightly seat that to the rear, okay? It's going to make it go through easier when it goes through all the way to the side. Okay, now we're going to finish. And we're going to drive it in. Okay, you obviously heard the difference when it finally seated. Now we have our locking shoulder in. You can see that the locking surface is properly located. We have the hole in. Everything is set. Now what we're going to do, we're going to check it with a no-go gauge, just to make sure, doubly certain, right? So we're going to take the bolt again. Now, this gauge, as I showed you, is a commercial gauge. It has a full rim. So when you use this gauge, if you've left the extractor on, you need to feed it into the bolt slot, sometimes with both hands. Now we're going to slide this in, and you're going to see it's not going, no matter how hard I push on the back, okay? Now we already know that it fits with the go gauge. Put our gauge back. Okay, the rifle is now set up and headspaced, okay? Everything is done. Now when you finish that stage, you've already taken care of all your assembly. Okay? We've run through that. So when that's all done, you get all your parts clean, all of them put on, and here's what you end up with. Properly assembled L1A1 FAL rifle. Okay? Now you can take it to the range and sight it in. Okay, we just finished putting an inch barrel in an inch receiver. Now if you were going to use an inch barrel in a metric receiver, you're going to breech it exactly the same way, using the washer, following all the steps. Now we're going to do metric to metric. And I have here a metric receiver, and I have here a metric barrel. Now, both threads have been cleaned, all our parts. We're going to screw this in. Okay, screw the barrel into the receiver, and what we're going to notice when we get it as far as it'll go, okay, it didn't come to our 15 degrees. What we have here is a situation where we have the receiver and the barrel, they're way out of alignment, okay? Now, on a metric receiver, it's barreled similar to a Mauser rifle, okay? So in other words, we have inside, we can have right in here a gap, which is what we've got right now, because it's stopped on the shoulder, but right here on the inside against the face of the barrel and the bearing surface in the receiver, there's a gap. So this requires lathe work to correct, okay? Now I'm going to show you on a barrel that's out of a receiver right now, okay? Now what we had no bearing surface here, right? We had bearing surface here on the shoulder. So what you're going to need to do is actually go into a lathe, remove part of the shoulder, okay? Now if you have a lathe and you're familiar with operation, you know you can calculate how much you have to take off based on the threads. If you don't have a lathe, do not attempt to do this. Farm the work out, okay? Now once you actually have everything corrected, the barrel is going to stop at about 15 degrees. We're going to show this one turn out so you can see it. It's going to stop about 15 degrees out. You'll put it in a barrel vise, use the supporting tool to hold the receiver. You'll bring it to vertical, okay? Once it's vertical, everything else is done the same way as an inch. You're going to use a headspace gauge, measure the size of the lug, find the correct lug, install a lug, recheck it with a no-go gauge, and it's up and done, okay? And that's a metric. Now we're going to show you what happens if you have an Israeli barrel or an Ishapur barrel. Remember, when we screwed it into a receiver, it stopped 1/4 inch out. What we have here is a standard 1-inch, 16 thread per inch die. We're going to screw it on, and what we're going to find is that when we spin it on, it's going to stop in exactly the same pace, about 1/4 inch out, okay? Now, following standard practice with a die, you're going to thread the barrel all the way up, okay? Obviously, you're going to turn it a little bit, thread it, and take it out, and get it finished. Now that we've corrected the threads on the barrel, this barrel will now fit an inch receiver or a metric receiver, but it does not require a washer. The barrel type determines a washer. An inch barrel needs a washer. A metric barrel or an Israeli barrel does not need a washer, even if it's used on an inch receiver. Now we're going to cover some of the modifications that you're going to find necessary if you put an inch kit on a metric receiver. Okay, here we have one of our metric receivers. It has the full length rail, okay, and the small magazine catch. First off, we're going to take a true metric top cover, okay? You'll notice that the support rib runs the whole length, especially back here at the rear, on both sides, okay? Now, this will slide right in. Okay, now what we have here is an inch top cover. And if you notice, there's this thick pad on each side. And as we said earlier on the L1A1, that's so that they can position these in case they have a half one. Now what happens if we put this on the receiver? When we slip it on the receiver, we're going to find that slides on, oops, it stops. It's stopped by these plates, okay? Now what you can do is creatively use a Dremel or something like that, and you thin the plates off, okay? When you do that, the top cover fits on perfect, okay? You don't have to buy an additional top cover. Now, another difference we're going to find on these receivers when we mix parts, this is our folding cocking handle from an inch. Now you'll notice that it starts in really good and it gets kind of tight, okay? What you need to do on these is take them off, take them on a block sandpaper. You want to sand the back side of this, okay? You can do it trial and error. You should disassemble it. Remember, we took the stud out, okay? Then, when you have it so it fits easy and nice, that's all that's required there. The hold open is the worst part to modify. This is an inch hold open. We have the hole. It starts in the hole, and it doesn't want to go, okay? Now we have two choices. You can either ream the hole, which I don't really like to do. I never like to work on the more expensive part. Always work on the cheap part. In this case, you can either reduce the diameter of the round section, or you can buy a metric hold open. And whichever way you do it, just be careful, make sure you clean it when you put it back together. Those are the only three things that you need to do to use an inch kit on a metric receiver. Now one of the other things we want to talk about was what we feel is the best modification from the full auto to the semi-auto. The receivers you're going to buy are going to be semi-auto receivers. Remember when we discussed the safety sear? Okay? Now if you'll notice, this one has a safety sear, this one doesn't. If you look at the rear of the two receivers right here, you'll notice how thick this one is and how thin this one is. This one has to have room for the safety sear. This one doesn't. It's that much thicker so that you can't have a safety sear in it. Okay? On the top, it's not machined to allow the safety sear. Okay? On this one, we can see we have the safety sear. Okay? On this one, we don't have room for it. Okay? So your receiver is semi-automatic. You don't have any problem there. But to be on the safe side, there's some modifications I'd really like to see you do. okay, we have the bolt and bolt carrier. Remember when we were discussing full auto, we said this side catches the trip. Now if you make both these sides the same length, in other words, bring this one back so it's even here, you've successfully converted a full auto bolt carrier to semi-auto. But most selectors in the military guns are going to be full automatic. In other words, they're going to have two cuts on the safety. Okay, what we want to do to convert this safety that allows fully automatic fire, okay? What we want to do is take the surface that allows the trigger to go up high enough so that the sear is no longer catching the hammer, okay? What we do is we just make it round, okay? This is a semi-auto. We have the surface here for fire, but this is fully round. It will not allow the trigger to come up high enough to release the sear, okay? Now, you can use Bondo or you can weld it, and that'll successfully make it so you'll have safe, fire, and another safe position, which will make you much safer with your FAL. As you can see, we've collected a lot of accessories for the FAL rifles. We have 30-round magazines. You'll find them curved. You'll find 30 rounds straight. The 20s we showed you during disassembly. And in states that require it or for target use, there are actually 10-round and 5-round magazines available. There's also a series of magazine loaders. You have inch style and you have metric. The interesting thing about the inch one, it will take loose rounds, it will load M14 mags and FAL mags both. On the inch series of rifles, you have wooden buttstocks that are available in various lengths, and they're marked. On the plastic, what they've done is they've modified the actual butt plate. And here you can see 4 different sizes of butt plates because the British Empire covered a lot of ground, a lot of different sizes of troops. Okay, with scope mounts, we have several different styles. They're generally mounted on the top cover and replace the other top cover you have on the rifle. This one accepts rings, various type scopes, and it's spring-loaded in the back so that it retains its zero on the rifle. In front of us, we have the DS Arms Ultra Sniper Rifle. Stainless steel barrel, large variable scope on top, and you notice the rail on this one will accept quite a few different ring configurations to take care of eye relief and various scopes. Otherwise, the basic receiver is the same one that you could build yourself. Towards the front of the rifle, we have some more military-oriented accessories. This is a replacement gas plug, and it in fact has the grenade launcher sights right on it. Now for iron-sighted rifles, in combat in jungle areas, the British developed this. What it does, it snaps over the barrel, this goes over the sight. Your gas plug sets in here, and their belief was that this would steer brush around it. The SAS used these in various countries. Muzzle brakes. The FAL has a tremendous numbers of muzzle brakes. This is off a G-series rifle used normally by the German Army. Slips on, turns, and locks. This is known as an FM universal device. It was 22 millimeter, so it could be used for grenades. Some countries developed a muzzle brake that would slide over this, lock onto the barrel, and it would turn it into a muzzle brake. You can see the holes are only exposed on the top. This is an STG style muzzle brake on an Austrian rifle. The idea behind this was you could put this against a barbed wire fence, turn it, shoot, and cut the wire. I guess if you couldn't go over the fence. This is a aftermarket muzzle brake provided so that you can put a muzzle brake on a rifle that's a post-band rifle. Here's one style of bayonet to fit a FAL rifle. This one, as you can see, is hollow in the back, and it actually went over one of the types of muzzle brakes on the FAL. Okay, now we're going to talk about various kinds of cleaning kits that were available for the FAL. This particular one right here was a Canadian. It had the most complicated FAL tool that was issued to the individual troop. Had punches, screwdrivers, extractor tools, gas adjustments. You could do just about anything to a FAL with the Canadian one. This is an Australian cleaning kit, and it actually came with a broken shell extractor, which you would hope you wouldn't have to use in the field. This is the Australian accessory kit, which goes along with the cleaning kit we just showed you. This has the 5-function tool, which we used when we were building our L1A1. Has a small brush for cleaning, and it has a tube of the Australian designed grease. This grease is very good for all the frictional areas, and it has a high corrosion resistance, and it also does not wash off with water. They found that quite useful in most of the places in Vietnam when Australia was fighting there. This is a metric set. What we have here is a pistol grip off a rifle, and inside we have our oil can, and it fits in the pistol grip and locks in a snap right inside the pistol grip. That's an interesting accessory. Now we have some tools, some of which we were using when we were working on the rifles. If you remember, we have the buttstock removal tool, which guides the recoil spring. A couple different styles here. These are available from most surplus dealers, as most of the items are. We use this to take off the handguard retaining nut. 2 styles. This is an Israeli, and it has also the square stud for front sight adjustment. This Belgian tool takes care of the gas adjustment and the removal of the carrying handle nut. This thing that looks just like a nut is in fact a flash hider tool of Canadian design to take the flash hiders on and off L1A1 rifles. Now when we were head spacing the gun, we had various head spacing shoulders. Now what we have here is a complete set of head spacing shoulders. You'll notice there's quite a few little boxes, and each one has recesses, and in fact shows all the different numbers that are available. If you're going to work on FAL rifles, this is one of the essential things you're going to need, are various sizes of lugs. Because unless you have a surface grinder, you can't modify any of the lugs to fit another gun. These are available from various dealers such as ASF Lithgow, and other surplus dealers will supply you with the various cleaning kits. The magazines are generally available. Muzzle brakes, well, you usually get one on a rifle. Okay, now if we haven't told you enough about individual guns, then this is one of the best books available right now on the FAL series. This is actually 3 books in one. It used to be issued as 3 different books. It's now in one complete volume. It'll tell you just about everything there is to know about the FAL rifle series. Now I'd like to show you a couple of guns and show you some accessories on the guns. Okay, this is what's currently available commercially as a post-band gun. You'll notice it has a look-alike muzzle brake on the front, but it's actually solid without any of the holes. Okay, that meets the new criteria for the law. Also, we have the thumb hole stock. Otherwise, this is a FAL rifle, just like you could build any day of the week. Okay, 308, very accurate, precise, and you notice that this one is built out of a kit and was refinished. You can build a rifle just like this. Now I'd like to show you what some of the other kits are available. Okay, you notice this rifle has a handguard that has a bipod on it. This is out of an STG-58 kit sold by DS Arms. These kits came out of Austria. They're all really nice shape. You notice the bipod folds down. You still have a handguard. Fold the bipod up. Makes a very compact, very nice rifle. This has the muzzle brake we talked about for cutting bob wire. This turned out to be a very nice gun. You can see the selector on this one has been pinned. They did that in addition to make certain that you can only put it on safe and fire. Now barrel length, as you noticed when we were doing the metric gun, we had a very short barrel. Now various barrel lengths are available for the FAL. You can see here's 2 different barrel lengths. Obviously, unless you're a Title II manufacturer or in a state that permits short-barreled rifles, you need to stick with a 16-inch barrel. But the FAL will work with a lot of different barrel lengths as long as you take care of your gas system. Okay, the last rifle I'd like to show you is the DS Arms Ultra Match rifle. Now this is a rifleman's rifle. Has almost all the features you could ever think about. Okay, you have a nice grip. They put the short mag in it so it doesn't conflict in any kind of a situation if you're coming out of a police car or a military vehicle. You have the large scope, Plenty of adjustment, plenty of power. The bipod is very light but substantial, and it's adjustable for height. You can adjust it for height. Now, in addition, I'd like to show you the barrel here. This is a specially made stainless steel barrel fitted to a new gas block. The length here to the receiver is the same on a standard, but a heavy barrel like this, in this particular gun, makes accuracy out to 600 yards very practical and very easy to obtain. You'll notice on the muzzle there is an additional level so that you can tell the cant when you're firing, so that you can take that into consideration on long-range targets. This is probably the ultimate in FAL sniping rifles available today. We haven't told you everything about a FAL, but we've told you how to take it apart, how to put it back together, how to identify metric parts, how to identify inch parts, how to build your rifle out of either kind of kit. You may have noticed we haven't told you a lot about troubleshooting with a FAL rifle. That's because there's not a lot of problems with FAL rifles. When you get your kit, you're going to clean it, you're going to inspect your parts. When you put it together the way we've said, you're going to end up with a reliable rifle. In the future, while you're using it, the things you want to keep an eye on and keep clean, you want to keep your hammer system clean, you want to watch for burrs developing on any of the sear notches, you want to make sure your gas system is cleaned, you want to make sure that you've got no carbon in there, you want to make sure if the rifle gets bumped that it hasn't dented one of the parts. If you experience problems with magazines, magazines are very economical. Replace magazines, you should have no problem. Now, remember when we were talking about gas adjustment. Gas adjustment on a FAL is very important. You want to adjust the gas for the type of ammunition that you're going to use. And you don't want to use any more gas than is absolutely necessary. So when you're ready to shoot your rifle for the first time, you want to adjust your gas. The easiest way to adjust it, put 2 rounds in the magazine, chamber 1 round, fire your rifle. If it doesn't pick up the second round, put that round into the chamber, load a fresh round in a magazine, close your gas a little bit, fire the round. If it still doesn't pick up the round, repeat the process until you have it operating on the least amount of gas that's necessary to make it operate. And that is what you want. You don't want excessive gas. Keep your bolt ways greased. Use brake-free where you need it. Gun should last as long as mine's lasted. Okay? Thanks a lot.
Hit it. For more information on FAL kits, parts, and accessories, you can contact Armin Merchant at P.O. Box 1593, West Sacramento, California 95691, or call 916-371-6900. Or contact DS Arms at 27 West 990 Industrial, Lake Barrington, Illinois 60010, or phone 847-277-7258.